So, what is knowledge resistance? That's what I'm going to talk about. But let me just say a couple of words first. Let's see if this works. Yes, it should work, yeah. About the program that we have. That's a full name, Knowledge Resistance, Causes, Consequences, and Cures. Here are the 4 PIs for the 4 different research groups that we have involved. We have Katrin Glüer there, who is the PI for the philosophy group, and she will be talking today, so you'll hear what she has to say. Then we have Henrik Ekengren Oskarsson, who is the PI for the political science group out of Gothenburg University. We have Torun Lindholm Ömer, who is here with us today, a PI for the psychology group, and then we have Jesper Strömbäck, who is the PI for the communication and media group out of Gothenburg University too. So we have Stockholm University, Gothenburg University, and then each PI has a number of researchers involved in their groups spread out across Europe mostly. We have some Americans involved too. So when we applied for this was in 2018 we applied for it, right? And we got it in 19. This was our original idea well, look, people are talking about knowledge resistance in all these different fields, in political science, in psychology, in philosophy, but there's no unified account, there's no unified approach. So we thought the idea would be to bring it together and try to get a hold on what this phenomenon is, to understand the mechanisms behind it, and how to mitigate, of course, how to sort of cure, and Torun will talk a little bit about that. And our central hypothesis was that knowledge resistance is this result of the complex interaction between emotions, cognition, social interaction, other people, and the flow of information, of course, and the politics around it. So that's why we thought we needed these 4 disciplines involved. Because before the research had been scattered across these disciplines, and now we wanted to bring it together. And this was the initial idea that we had. We had 4 work packages according to in each of these disciplines, but the idea also was that we would increasingly work across the work packages, across the disciplines, and that's what's happening now, and that's quite interesting, we think. So we have the philosophy work package that was looking at this is how we first formulated it. Things have changed a bit, but it's a basic idea. We look at foundational issues having to do with rationality and reasoning and the nature of knowledge and evidence and things like that belong to philosophy. And then we have work package 2, which Torun is a PI of then, which was about psychological mechanisms underlying this resistance and how to mitigate, how to cure, as it were. Then the political science work package had to do with partisanship, ideological predispositions, the role that plays when you interpret and evaluate information. Polarization is a very big topic in there. We can talk about that if you like. I'm not going to talk about that today. We don't have the political scientists here today, but we can talk about those issues too, if you like. And then, of course, the role of media. Because if there's one thing that, like I said, these phenomena have been around forever. The psychological mechanisms have been with us forever. But if there is one thing that has changed, of course, it is the information environment. And one way to describe the new information environment that we're in, which we do in our recent edited volume we have on Routledge, is just to describe it as a high-choice information environment, where basically society overnight went from a fairly controlled information environment, especially a media environment, where you have established newspapers and other types of media where there are, responsible journalists and editors. It wasn't all great, but it wasn't free for all. There were some gatekeepers there. And then we moved from that basically overnight around 2010 to a situation where we have this high-choice information environment, where the number of sources in principle is unlimited, and the choice of source falls increasingly on the individual, and it's suddenly up to us to determine what's reliable and what's not. And there are lots of actors out there that realize that they can use this to spread unreliable information, and that's the situation we're in now. And that interacts with our psychology in various ways. And again, we don't have the media people here, so we won't say so much about that today, but we are very happy to talk about that in discussion as well, if you like. What I thought I would do is something rather basic today, before I hand over to Katrine and Turan, I thought I would try to clarify the central concept here, namely knowledge resistance. What are we even talking about? So that's what I'm going to do, basically. And to do that, of course, you have to start with something for the philosophers here that is very, very basic, namely the concept of knowledge, what knowledge is. And we sort of start out from just a very, very traditional idea of knowledge that goes back to Plato. There's an ongoing discussion about whether these conditions of knowledge are sufficient or not, but most people will say they're necessary in one way or the other. Where the basic idea is just that to know something, for example, that the Earth is round, you have to believe it. If you don't believe it, you don't know it. If you believe it's flat, you don't know it. But you can't just believe it, because lots of beliefs that you have are not knowledge because they're not even true. You can't know that the Earth is flat because it's not. So you need truth for knowledge. But then, of course, you need one more thing, because you may just be lucky, you may have a belief that's true, because you guessed the right answer, but you don't know it because you have no evidence, no grounds, no reasons for your belief. So basically the idea is that knowledge involves at least a belief that's true and justified. Perhaps something more, but this is what we need for the purposes of talking about knowledge resistance. And when it comes to the resistant, it's the third component, the reasons, that play a very central role. The evidence, because it's the evidence that's resisted, and that's what I'm going to say a few words about. But I'm going to say a few words about these three components and how that kind of guides how you have to approach this. So first, a couple of words about the belief component here, because there's a lot of data out there on people's views on things, a lot of opinion polls, right? So we know, for example, that in the US still, now things did go a little better Tuesday than we expected, but we know that about 60 to 70, more like 70% of registered Republicans believe that the 2020 election, claim that the 2020 election was rigged, it was stolen, Biden is not a legitimate president. Now that seems like a type of knowledge resistance, right? Because there's been so much investigations into this, and there's zero evidence that the election was stolen, and there's lots of evidence that the voting machines worked and all that. So if 70% of Republican voters believe that the election was stolen, then they are knowledge resistant. Of course, the hard part here is to know whether they actually believe it or whether they say it, just say it. To cheer along Trump because they like Trump or whatever. And so this is one sort of fundamental issue when you discuss, you say, well, people are knowledge resistant because they say these things. Well, we also need to know that they believe it. They may just say it because they cheer on Trump, for example. And similar issues arise when it comes to vaccine denial. There's been a lot of evidence, or there's been a lot of cases where people live in communities where there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, and people claim in their communities that vaccines are dangerous, and then people sneak away to get the vaccine so no one will see it. So that shows that they're saying these things because it's important to belong to the group and not go do things that is not approved by the group. But they don't actually believe that vaccines are dangerous, so they sneak out to get the vaccine. So this is one thing you need to know when you determine whether someone is knowledge resistant. What do they actually believe, as opposed to just say? So that's one thing. And this is also related to when we talk about science denial, because it's not always completely clear. I mean, there are people, of course, out there. You own a tobacco company, so you say cigarettes are not dangerous. And you do what you can to spread the distrust in the science around the dangers of cigarette smoke and so on. That's a famous example. The same case, of course, with climate deniers. But actually, I mean, if you look at the oil companies and coal and oil companies, they did their own research. They knew long ago, the people involved there, they knew long ago that this carbon dioxide emissions is causing global warming. They just wanted to suppress the science. So those people are not actually, they don't believe that in the statement that carbon dioxide emissions don't cause global warming. They just say it because it's convenient for them. So they're not knowledge resistant, they're just not acting in accordance with their beliefs. So the people who qualify as knowledge resistant here are the ones that genuinely doubt the conclusions of science, of course. So that's also a point about belief. Okay, let me say 2 words about truth. There's a lot to be said about that, but all I'm going to say here is that you can only know that which can be true or false. That's part of, since we start from this definition of knowledge as true, justified belief. So it has to be a statement, a belief that can be true or false. And this makes it important when you discuss knowledge resistant that you're actually talking about factual propositions. Things like carbon dioxide cause global warming, or vaccines are safe, or whatever. And don't get into value judgments, because then it's trickier. So if you say that we should raise gasoline taxes, because that's a good way to counteract, to take a Swedish example, to counteract the emissions and the global warming. That's a policy statement. And always when you talk about policy statements, you're also talking about values, because you set certain goals. And when it comes to values, whether value judgments are true or false, that's very controversial philosophically. Even if they are, it's not clear how we determine whether they're true or false. So let's set those aside and focus on the factual beliefs when you talk about knowledge resistance. And that's a bit of a problem, because some of the literature, there's some experiments, very famous ones on the death penalty, for example, people for or against the death penalty. And it was shown that even when you give people lots of information about the death penalty, they don't change their views. Now, that could be a kind of knowledge resistance, they don't take in the facts, or it could be that they just believe that, well, you should never kill a person, no matter what the consequences are of having that kind of penalty. Or, the other one, you should definitely kill people out of revenge, no matter what the practical, consequences are. So you need to sort of keep these things distinct. You need to focus on the factual beliefs. That's another important thing. All right. And so when we started out our program, therefore, we thought we need to pick factual claims, and we want to pick interesting ones because when it gets contested, it is when it is related to, when it has policy relevance. Because knowledge resistance can arise with any type of belief, of course. It can be beliefs about how good I am about something, or how that my health is as strong now, or I'm as healthy now as I was 20 years ago, or something like that. Beliefs like that we try to make ourselves believe. But the ones that are kind of interesting are the ones that have consequences for society. So we have the focus in our program is on these, on climate change, factual statements relating to climate change, immigration, vaccines, and GMOs, genetically modified organisms is the word. When it comes to vaccines, it's of course interesting, because when we started out in 2019, we didn't know there was going to be a pandemic. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know that the vaccine hesitancy would be such a huge problem across the world when it came. Of course, it was amazing. We got a vaccine within a year once the pandemic broke, right? But then the vaccine hesitancy started causing a lot of trouble. So for us, we've been collecting all sorts of data, especially the media group, but also psychology groups, relating to hesitancy on the COVID-19 vaccines. So that's interesting. So we chose these topics, these sort of factual areas, because they have, these topics have relevance for policy. And it is precisely when it comes to policy, it becomes a problem, of course, for society, but it's also those that tend to get politically charged, those factual beliefs, and that's when the knowledge resistance tends to arise. We'll talk a little bit about this. They're polarized, these factual topics too, polarized along political lines, which is also interesting. And again, they concern facts that admit of scientific evidence. That is, their ways of finding out. That's very important if you're going to be talking about knowledge resistance, of course, like I said. All right, so let me say a couple of words. Sometimes when people talk about knowledge resistance, they put it this way. They say it's a tendency to believe what one wants to believe. And that's in a way, despite what the evidence shows. And that's in a way fine to put it that way when one talks about it in everyday life. But it's sort of philosophically not a great way to put it, because it sort of presupposes that you can decide what to believe, that it is something, so that if I want to believe that right now that it's daytime and the sun is shining, I can't get myself to believe that. And so this is a big debate in philosophy, whether we can have direct control over our beliefs. So it's not so great to talk about it that way. And it's not really a choice in that sense, although there are choices involved. So we instead prefer to talk about knowledge as the tendency to resist available evidence. That's our starting point. Then you have to unpack this in lots of ways. I will say a couple of words about that. Resisting the evidence then consists in not drawing the proper conclusion. That is the conclusion that's supported by the evidence. Of course, evidential support comes in degrees. That's an important point. And if it's not, if it's quite weak, then your support, then there isn't a proper conclusion to draw yet. But if it gets over a certain threshold, you get a justification for a belief. That's a rational thing to believe then. Of course, also different parts of available evidence can point in different directions. If so, you shouldn't form a firm belief either until you have sorted out what's the strongest evidence pointing to the proper conclusion, which is then determined by all the evidence taken together. So it can be complicated, these things, and that's an important thing to remember. So if knowledge resistance involves resisting the evidence, then there's the empirical question: what are the psychological mechanisms involved? And because knowledge resistance isn't just random rationality. It isn't like, woo, crazy things like that randomly. There are these regular, stable mechanisms that can intervene and interfere and prevent us from accepting the available evidence. And there are many candidates, and they are given different names and different points in the history of this topic too. Here are some we will hear a little bit more about. Motivated reasoning, confirmation bias, of course. Motivated reasoning is reasoning that's driven by as desire, by values, rather than by evidence. It's called, sometimes it's said, it's not truth-directed. There's other things, bias, memory retrieval, truth bias, etc. So there are many candidate mechanisms here that have this result, that you resist the evidence. Before I finish, I want to say a couple of words about the evidence, the relevant evidence in typical cases of knowledge resistance. I mean, if you, at the very basic level, philosophers can distinguish between two types of evidence. On the one hand, obviously, there is experiential evidence. That is evidence that we get from our senses, what we see and feel and hear and so on. And that, of course, is the kind of evidence that makes it possible for us to sort of survive on a daily basis, orient ourselves in the world. We share that with the animals. They have that too, of course. But what's interesting about human knowledge, if you think about the kind of knowledge we're talking about now, knowledge about climate change or knowledge about vaccines or about crime rates and so on, human knowledge is typically such that we don't, most of the things that we know about society or science, we don't know directly because through experience. We know it because we got it from other sources, from other people that know these things. And that's why philosophers talk a lot about the role of testimony when it comes to knowledge. We have this sort of division of epistemic labor, as it were, in society, where we all kind of collect knowledge in our sort of areas of expertise or in our daily lives, and then we can use language to communicate that knowledge. And then knowledge accumulates, it spreads across the community, and accumulates from generation to generation, and all that. So testimony is really, really central for human knowledge. So the very important source of knowledge, very important kind of evidence, is evidence from other people who are reliable sources of knowledge. And this is a great strength for us, because it means we can have this amazing spread of knowledge and knowledge accumulation. But it's also vulnerability, because it means that a lot of the knowledge that we get about society and science and so on, we get on the basis of trust. Because I can only get the knowledge from these sources if I trust them. And trust can be manipulated in different ways. So when we talk, and if you look at the standard cases of knowledge resistance, in these cases of vaccines and climate and so on, it's indeed cases where the evidence is testimonial. It's evidence that comes from a source that you don't accept as a reliable informant. So one can discuss exactly how to think about this, but in the program we think about this kind of, if you were to formulate the content of the sort of evidence that you get from other people, you can just formulate it this way. You can say a certain source says that something. So the New York Times says that the election was safe or was not rigged, for example. Or what's his name? I don't remember his name anymore. The head of the US vaccine program. Anyhow, he says that vaccines are safe. Right. So then, if this is a reliable source and if you trust the source, you get the knowledge. But if you don't trust the source, you will not form the belief that vaccines are safe or that climate change is caused by carbon dioxide, and therefore you won't get the knowledge. So trust plays an absolutely central role in knowledge, in receiving knowledge in the case of humans. And this is also where a lot of the trouble arises. Some people have said that, well, is what we're facing now a trust problem or a misinformation problem? And the answer is, of course, both, that they interact in various ways. It is extremely difficult, I mean, this is the point I was making before, for people to evaluate the truth of scientific statements. I don't know enough about climate science. When a climate denier comes to me and has sort of detailed arguments about it, I don't know enough very often. It is a very difficult, tricky situation. But the typical situation where people reject, and there's a lot of data on that, why do people, when you ask people why is the main reason they reject climate science, there is typically, the main reason is a conspiracy theory about the researchers. So some theory according to which these climate researchers, they have a political agenda, or they're paid by some industry or other, or they, whatever it can be. Some conspiracy theory. And that's common for all types of science denial, that the main reason people reject the testimony from these researchers is some kind of conspiracy theory. That was very clear when it came to the vaccines, about COVID-19 vaccines. In fact, there were some really wild conspiracy theories there, as you know, where Bill Gates was involved, and they were implanting microchips in your arm, and there were all sorts of things like that. So the trust point, trust is essential for knowledge, but trust can be manipulated through disinformation, and conspiracy theories are very, very central in this. But trust can also go the other way, of course. People may be too trusting when it comes, people trust everything Trump says, for example. No matter how many false things he says, people trust. And that can, so it can go, you can get misplaced trust, and you can get this case of loss of trust in reliable sources. So trust is an essential part of what we're looking at. We have, for example, the political scientists in Gothenburg. They're at the SOM Institute, and they do a lot of polling on trust in various ways. It's quite interesting to look at that. Finally, let me just say one word, because I said that knowledge resistance is this tendency to resist available evidence. And to give that some real content, you have to say more about what available evidence is, of course. But we can at least distinguish between two basic cases. One case is where you, the subject, you have the evidence. You read the New York Times, and you read that the New York Times says that the election was safe because these sources say that. So you have the evidence, and then you reject it because New York Times is fake media. Right? So that's one situation. The other situation is where you decide never to look at New York Times again because it's fake media. So that's where you don't even take in the evidence. And you do want to include that as a type of knowledge resistance, although not just because you missed reading the Times or whatever. So there's a little bit of work you have to do here. So we also want to call this what we call wide knowledge resistance, which is that there is evidence that the subject could easily have had. You could just have looked it up. It says on the homepage of the IPPC what's going on. You can just look it up, right? But you avoid it. And this can be more or less conscious. And can be the psychological mechanisms of these mechanisms of selective exposure and attention. Which, of course, is not knowledge resistant if it's just a failure of attention and exposure. So it gets tricky here when you need to separate them. So there are lots of detection problems here when it comes to designing experiments, for example. You have to do that quite carefully. All right, and we just put this book out, which is the first volume on this topic, which is for all 4 disciplines, an edited volume. So I will now hand over to Katrin.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy work package. And I mean, one of the things when you look at an interdisciplinary program like this, one of the questions you might ask, why is philosophy even in there? And I think Åsa has already done a marvelous job at showing us one aspect of why that is great, and that's because you can get some conceptual clarity and define the phenomenon. We are talking about it with the help of philosophers, because as she was saying, the concept of fact or knowledge resistant is out there in the public sphere, and the term is used in very, very many different ways. So one could have very, very many different projects that have this title, knowledge resistance, and you just sort of need to decide what is it we want to investigate. I would like to illustrate why philosophy in such an interdisciplinary project in 2 different ways, too. And one of them is very structural and basically not limited to this project. So if you have highly interdisciplinary research, shared concepts and a common understanding of the larger conceptual terrain are crucial. And we have noticed this in our project. There are terms that the different groups use in very different ways. And then it's just useful to have a philosopher around who's sort of used to drawing these conceptual maps. If you use the concept this way, then such and such will follow. And let's get to some sort of common understanding here so that we know what we are talking about. One such term, to just use an example, is belief. Some people call what we philosophers here will call beliefs. Some people in our groups talk about perceptions. We philosophers would never do that unless we talk about sense perception. So that's just something where you need to sort of agree on how you want to use the terminology and what kinds of consequences that has for other things you are saying. And then philosophers are also quite good at sharpening these conceptual tools that you're using, and that was a lot of what Åsa was doing in the first part, and they are also quite good at bringing out argument structures and missing premises and things like that. So in a sense, every interdisciplinary project should have some philosophers, just for this reason. Okay, the other thing I now want to talk about in a little more detail has to do with epistemology and reasoning, because when it comes to knowledge resistance, actually, some epistemology can be quite useful. And that's what I'm going to try to illustrate. So an important part of the project is about reasoning, but it's about bad reasoning. Knowledge-resistant belief formation is irrational. It's irrational in an epistemic sense. It's not truth-directed reasoning. And that is part of how we have defined the phenomenon we want to talk about here, that is irrational in this sense. But then we are faced with the fact that not everything that on the face of it looks like knowledge resistance, in fact, is knowledge resistance. Sometimes it is perfectly rational to reject a piece of available evidence. Think of a coin. Someone gives you a coin, you toss it. It comes up heads 3 times in a row, or 4. You're in a situation where you don't know anything about this coin. Now you have pretty good reason to think that there's something wrong with that coin. At least that hypothesis should get a higher value in your thinking now, because you don't know anything about this coin. If it was fair, shouldn't it by now have come up the other way at least once? Something like that. You'll start thinking there might be something wrong with this coin, and that's rational. So you have some evidence that points in the direction that this is not a fair coin. Now you're someone else, and you have tossed that coin already 1,000 times, and it comes out roughly equal every time. And now you have these 4 head tosses. This piece of evidence, the 4 head tosses, doesn't give you as much of a reason to think that the coin is unfair than in the other situation. It might be rational to simply think, this is a fluke. I don't need to entertain the hypothesis that this coin isn't fair. Okay, so what this illustrates is that whether rejecting a piece of evidence is rational or not depends on your overall epistemic situation. What kind of evidence on the matter do you already have? How good is that evidence? In which direction does it point? And so on. As Åsa was saying, you need to weigh the evidence against each other. So if we have rejections, if we have reactions to evidence that consist in rejecting pieces of evidence, and we want to detect and investigate irrational tendencies in these reactions, we need a pretty clear picture of how the rationality or not of such a reaction actually depends on epistemic situation of the subjects, and that there are many factors that play a role. I gave you this toy example of the coin. In reality, this is much more complicated, and there are different factors that one needs to know about. But in general, there is this dependency relation, and the rationality of a reaction to evidence is a function of the factors in this situation. And that is something where an epistemologist can actually come in quite handy if you want to deal with thinking about how a reaction in a certain situation could actually be rational, even though it might look irrational on the face of it. Okay. And we philosophers have done quite a bit of that in the project, come up with these ideas. That could actually be rational if you think such and such. Of course, you might wonder now, does rationality matter? What does it matter whether these reactions are rational or irrational? They seem to have detrimental effects because there are these tendencies. So why even care about that? Well, precisely because they seem to matter. If a tendency to reject evidence of a certain kind has detrimental effects on our decision-making, it might be good to know how to counteract it. And how to do that will crucially depend on whether, or to which extent, the tendency is rational. If it is rational, information and argument presumably would help. But if, for instance, it is the result of motivated reasoning, this appears doubtful. So quite a lot actually hangs on the question of whether there's rationality here or not, and how much. Okay. And this brings me to a more concrete case. Take fact polarization. That is political polarization over matters that should be decided by scientific evidence and not by political affiliation. There seems to be increasing amounts of that, at least in Western societies. There are quite good data seeming to show that. Now, a prominent hypothesis, for which there actually is a lot of evidence, is that politically motivated reasoning is at least one of the main factors, or the main factor, driving this polarization. So that would be eminently irrational, politically motivated reasoning. Here's how one of the main proponents of this hypothesis explicates what motivated reasoning is. It's the tendency of individuals to unconsciously conform assessment of factual information to some goal collateral to assessing its truth. So you have a goal, it somehow interferes with your reasoning, it somehow influences your reasoning, let's say, but the goal is not finding out the truth of the matter. It's some other goal that drives this. Okay. And according to Dan Cahan, who is the main proponent here, in politically motivated reasoning, the truth-independent goal is what he calls identity protection. So he thinks that there are certain beliefs that have become what he calls identity markers for certain political groups. And for instance, there is vaccine safety and climate change that these days seem to be connected with a right-wing political identity, at least in the United States. One thing Åsa didn't say earlier was that when we came into this, we picked vaccines because we wanted things that cut across the political spectrum. But vaccine hesitancy has switched from the left to the right while we are at it. So now both climate change and vaccine safety are identity markers on the right. Okay, so what happens if you are giving in to politically motivated reasoning? That is that you will undervalue evidence against an identity marker in order to protect your political or cultural identity. So in order to stick with the belief that climate change is not man-made or something like that, you will give evidence to the contrary a lower evidential value than it actually has. That's what Cahan thinks. Okay. And this is a pretty cool hypothesis because it not only explains partisan conflict over individual facts, but also why there is this clustering that we see. That is why certain seemingly unrelated factual beliefs predict one another. For instance, beliefs about vaccine safety now are probabilistically dependent on beliefs about climate change in certain groups. Okay. However, and this is the point I now want to make, detecting whether something actually is politically motivated reasoning is not easy. So, and I'll illustrate this with a simplified case. Let's assume that indeed climate change is a matter of partisan conflicts between two groups. Let's call them the L's and the R's. And assume that we design a clever experiment in which both L's and R's tend to reject evidence against their respective climate beliefs. This might well be the result of politically motivated reasoning, but it doesn't have to be. Here is a little bit about what such an experiment could look like. And this, again, it's based on an actual experiment, but it's simplified, just to illustrate the point. Assume we are making an experiment where our subjects are presented with a picture of someone who's presented as a scientist. Let's call him Brian Bologna. He looks very expert-like. Put in whatever your stereotype of an expert is. Is described as a climate researcher with a prestigious affiliation, academy memberships, and excellent publications. Next, in one of the experimental conditions of this study, You tell your subjects that Belloni said that anthropogenic global warming does not exist. And then in the last step, you ask them to rate his climate science expertise. The result most probably will be that the R's tend to rate Belloni's expertise significantly higher than the L's. And that's, of course, very interesting. And political motivation might be the explanation in both cases. It might. But now, imagine that you take part in the experiment and that you have solid prior knowledge of climate change, climate science. You really know your climate science. Then Belloni's statement gives you a good reason to think that he can't be much of an expert, despite all the credentials that have been flashed at you. And this holds even if you also have political motivation for this response, even if you also are, in fact, belonging to the L political group. So you have motivation, and you also have good reasons for the very same conclusion, let's say. In that case, we cannot tell just from your response whether it is based on your reasons or on your motivation. It might be either, it might even be both. Now, this might be a problem in cases where actually the prior knowledge and the political motivation correlate throughout your subject pool for this experiment. If they do, the experiment cannot tell responses resulting from motivated reasoning apart from perfectly rational ones. And note, we get a similar detection problem even in cases where it's mere prior belief that correlates with political motivation. Your prior belief might also give a good explanation for your response. Then, of course, there's a follow-up question, whether that prior belief itself might be caused by political motivation or be irrational in some other sense. You can't decide that just on that basis. That's why I put into the description at first that you have good knowledge and therefore good reasons, and therefore your rejection of the evidence that was given you was rational. Thank you.
The question that has remained here, what do we do to counteract knowledge resistance? Do we have an answer? I would say perhaps not really. It would have been wonderful if we could have a quick fix for this. What we have done in the psychology group, and also which we have published in this volume that Åsa showed, we have done a systematic review of the studies that have tried to counteract knowledge resistance. And I would have loved to say that it's a grand scale, that you can do this and everything is all right, but fortunately it's on a small scale then, but from individual to individual it might make a difference. I will show you some examples from this review that we did. Framing is a central concept here. And as we have already heard, and you know, some groups show high skepticism toward even solid empirical evidence. And as we also, both Åsa and Katrin has mentioned, in the US, for example, Republicans are generally more skeptical towards science that suggests human-caused climate change than are Democrats. And this skepticism among Republicans has been attributed to various dispositions among conservatives. So, for example, that they have a greater sensitivity to negative information, or maybe a stronger disposition than others towards motivated cognition. Another possible explanation, and perhaps more parsimonious also, could be that the rejection of climate change among conservatives in the US has to do not so much about the facts and the evidence, but rather with the suggested solutions to climate change, to the climate change problem. And we know that in discussions about how to solve climate crisis, these discussions have often focused on different forms of restrictive governmental policies. And these restrictive governmental policies runs directly counter to core Republican values because they believe in a free market and limited governmental regulation. So when suggested solutions to climate change involved increased governmental regulation, this is head-on counter to a value that is central to most Republicans. What happens then with Republicans' climate crisis skepticism if a suggested solution to this crisis is compatible with their ideology? So Campbell Kay conducted a study. This is one of the studies included in our review. They have this is experimental psychology, so I just say that is. They have Republican and Democratic participants first read a text from a scientific panel, IPCC, as that also mentioned, International Panel on Climate Change. And then they are randomized to read about 1 or 2 policy solutions to climate change. So in the government regulation condition, the suggestion is a restrictive emission policy that, as I just said, it contradicts core beliefs of many Republicans. In the free market-friendly condition, the solution emphasizes how the US could profit from green technology. And this is, of course, compatible with Republican values, but also actually with Democratic ideologies. And next, when they have read this, they rate the likelihood that humans have caused climate change. This is a figure from this paper. What you see is the ratings from the Democrats. The white bar is Democrats who have read about the free market-friendly solution, and the gray bar is the Democrats who have read about the government regulation. And they sort of agree that humans have caused climate change. They're almost in the top of the scale. Republicans reading about government regulations solutions, they don't believe in this at all. Very, very low belief. How about when they read about free market-friendly solutions to the problem of climate change? Well, okay, it might be some climate change, but we are here to solve it. I think this is a very interesting finding. Oh, yes. So when you have a solution to the problem that is compatible with the person's ideology, then it's suddenly much more acceptable. So that's a thing that we can actually have as a tool in our toolbox about to try to combat knowledge resistance. Argument compositions. This is, you can distinguish argument into strong mechanistic ones with a high explanatory power where, show in a stepwise manner how A leads to D. So A leads to B, and from B to C, and from C to D. And then you have weak arguments with low explanatory power that are often circular also in nature. The question here is, can the composition of an argument regarding a polarized issue affect biased interpretations? This is just an example of arguments with high explanatory and low explanatory value. High, rising global temperatures from human-caused excess carbon dioxide are leading to poor air quality that is negatively affecting our health. This is because rising temperatures increase ground level ozone that traps all the pollutants, I can almost say these words, like allergens, and this poor air quality leads to bad asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and other diseases. So here you can see from A to B, from B to C. And low explanatory value. Climate is always changing and always will. This is because the climate has always been unstable and will remain that for a very long time. Therefore, there is no reason to believe that humans are contributing to global warming. So Johnson, he take this composition of argument to test climate skeptics' reasoning when they evaluate climate change material. So he recruited from some obscure site, I don't remember where, but strong climate change skeptics, really hardcore skeptics. And then he asked them to rate the convincingness of arguments with moderate or high explanatory value, and also arguments that were pro or anti-climate change. They were randomized into two conditions, one or two conditions. In one group, they were asked to carefully and thoughtfully evaluate the arguments, not exactly how they should do it, but just do it carefully. And in the other group, participants are asked to focus on explanatory power, just in the way I said. How well does the conclusion lead from the arguments? How well the argument explain how the main point lead to the main outcomes. The results indicated that the skeptics, not surprisingly, were generally rated anti-climate change argument higher than pro-climate change argument, but this is what happens in the careful focus condition. The light gray bars are pro-climate change arguments, the convincingness, and the black bars are the anti-climate change argument. And you see that in the careful focus condition, or even when you have high explanatory power in both pro and anti-climate change arguments, they rate the anti-climate change argument as more convincing. In this explanatory power focus, when they have been asked exactly how to evaluate the arguments, we still see the same difference in the arguments with moderate explanatory power. But when they have this focus and there is high explanatory power in the arguments, they actually rate them as equally convincing, both the anti and pro arguments. And actually also what they tested that was when they had this explanatory power, it increased these skeptics' pro-environmental intentions. So that's also something that's quite interesting. Also given that they are really not a bit skeptic, but they are really, really skeptic. So I want to, the final study that I want to show is one of the studies that we have done in the project. And I hope to be able to explain this because it's a bit difficult, it's a bit complex. It starts with this notion that people are more influenced by their expectations, their motives, or their ideologies, the more ambiguous a stimulus is, because ambiguous stimuli opens up room for your motivations, ideologies, or whatever it is, to taint interpretations of stimuli. So the question here is, could effects of ideologies in interpretations of polarized information decrease if information is presented in a way that reduces ambiguity? So what we did here was that we examined conclusions from a numerical problem that was either neutral or ideologically polarized, and we tested effects of participants' ideology. The specific ideology that we measured here was right-wing authoritarianism, which is, you can say, it's a proxy for conservatives, I mean liberal. If you're high in this RWA, right-wing authoritarianism, you are very conservative. If you are low, you are very liberal. So that's a proxy for it. And now comes the complex part of it. So what we did was that we showed participants 2-by-2 tables. One of the conditions, we had a neutral problem in this 2-by-2 table. And in the table, they were to say, but the table showed that the relation between two variables. In the neutral problem, it was the relation between using a new skin cream and the existence of skin rashes. So this is what it looks like. I think I can point here. So this is one condition where we have, you see here, 2 by 2 table, and on the rows here we have number of patients who did use the skin cream, and those who did not use the skin cream. And on the columns here we have the number of patients who got better and who got worse in the rash. And this is, if you are going to say, does this table indicate that the skin cream increased or decreased rash? If you're quick in your math, you can see this is about 25% of those who used this skin cream got worse, while only about not really 20% who did not use this. Then the conclusion would be that this skin cream may increase the rash. And then we have the opposite condition, where those who used the skin cream had less rash, they got better from the rash, and so the correct conclusion here is that the skin cream decreased rash. So we have this sort of complex 2 by 2 table. This is the neutral problem. Then we have the polarized problem, where we expected that our measure of ideology would affect participants' ability to draw the right conclusion. And this is, the polarized problem was here whether generous rules for Muslim prayer rooms in a European country support, if generous rules for Muslim prayer rooms increased or decreased Islamic extremism in this city or town where the rules have been changed or not changed. So we see exactly the same 2 by 2 tables here with the same numbers, but here we have different content. Number of German towns that adopted more generous rules for Muslim prayer rooms, and German towns that did not change the rules. Islamic support for Islamic extremists has decreased and increased. And the correct conclusion here would be that more generous rule has actually led to an increase in support for Islamic extremism. And in this, so this is the increase condition, and this is the decrease. So we have just, exactly as the same formulation as the neutral problem. So this is what we first did. So people saw one of these four 2 by 2 tables. They indicated what the table indicated, whether it was an increase or a decrease, either in skin rash or extremism. And then they did some other tasks when they have stated the conclusion. And then, after some other task, they come back with this 2 by 2 table, but now in a more unambiguous form. So what we did when they saw the problem the second time is that we gave them the percentages. So it's not only raw data here, but the percentages, and it makes it much more easy to see actually what the pattern is. So this is a scenario. Sorry. Yeah, this is a scenario with the rash and the percentages, and this is the scenario with the extremism. This is the increase scenario. So the results then. Did you follow that? Or do I okay? Say just objective if I'm too unclear here. So in the rash scenario, we didn't really expect that this ideology measure would have an effect on the different scenarios. But we saw in the neutral scenario here on skin rash, first we can just see very clearly that the performance is quite low. It's more or less at chance level, 50%. The red bars are those who said that rash decreases, and the green bars is that, no, it's the accuracy, sorry. The accuracy when the skin rash decreases and when it increases. And it's not really, I mean, it's a low performance, no real trends in any time. And then the second conclusion accuracy, after they have seen the percentages, the unambiguating information, we can first of all we can see a dramatic increase in accuracy. It really seem to have simplified the problem for them. And again, we don't have any clear tendencies here. In the prayer room scenario, where you should see the relation between generous rules for Muslim prayer rooms and support for extremism, we expected that participants high in conservative, who were highly conservative, they would have more difficulty seeing the correct conclusion when generous rules led to a decrease in extremism. They would be much more proficient, is the hypothesis, when it increased, because that aligns with their ideology. And vice versa for those who are more liberal, they would have more difficulty, be more inclined to see that the table showed that generous rules would lead to decrease in support for extremism, because that's aligning with their ideology. So the initial conclusion accuracy, we see exactly the expected results. Participants who are liberal, they are more correct when the table shows that support decreases with more generous rules for prayer rooms than when it increases, and exactly the opposite pattern for those who are high in conservativeness. They are much more correct when generous rules give an increase in support for extremism. So what happens then? This is the really critical test. What happens then when they have this unambiguated with percentages after they had seen this? Again, we see a drastic increase in accuracy, and actually these tendencies towards motivated reasoning in alignment with your ideology seem to have vanished almost completely. So this suggests that if you can present information in a very, very clear and unambiguous way, that could actually reduce the room for biases to play out. And that was all. Thank you.
So I found the last experiment very interesting. I just want to ask a simple question for clarification about it, because you said it was in a case which was clear when you got this different result. But it didn't seem to me to be clearer. It's just easier to grasp.
That's a better word. That's a better word.
So the first one was also very clear.
Yeah.
But it was harder.
But it's difficult,
to read it and understand it. So it was, the dimension wasn't clarity, but it was easy to understand.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's a better conceptualization of it.
Other comments? Questions? Camilla?
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting presentations of a very interesting project. I had a question to the first example with explanatory power, because I found it actually quite amazing that people would just grasp the concept of explanatory power, as opposed to what was the first one, was the
careful and thoughtful. Yeah.
So my question is, these people are not given any kind of tools for understanding the difference between the two kinds of careful reading and explanatory power?
No, careful reading is just their own, they have to use their own interpretation. But in the explanatory focus condition, if I remember this correctly now, because I've read several of these papers now, they are told that an argument with high explanatory power, you can see exactly what I said, how the conclusion is derived from the arguments, so to speak. So, yeah.
But that in itself, I mean, having taught philosophy 101 to several students, to explain, to derive things like that is not all that. So I was just quite amazed.
Yeah, but I can agree with that. It's an amazing phenomenon that it seemed to work in this study. And this researcher Johnson, he has done a lot of study with this explanatory focus compared with careful and thoughtful reasoning, and it seemed to be a tool, at least in his experiment, that works. I don't know whether it would do that in a class at university, but worth a try, maybe, I don't know.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, I'm glad we ended with some positive news about how presenting the information in a clearer way could help, and that's good. Although surely there are experiments that indicate the opposite too, where these situations where you test groups with a lot of scientific knowledge and others with less so, and they respond in pretty much the same way. So sometimes you just find that the scientifically very well educated, they will just dig in even more resourcefully and fight back. So defend their prior conception. So there have been studies of that sort too, which indicate that look, it's not just about communicating clearly, increasing scientific knowledge.
Well, it's not completely clear whether, I mean, there are results going in different directions with people who are smart and well educated. I think it's Kahan who has been arguing that, but he has some result where you can see that if you have a if you're well educated and good in numeric analysis, that you can be even more biased then. But actually there are several studies that have come more lately that show that that doesn't happen really. So.
So a more upbeat message. So a more upbeat message.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Katrin?
I hope you're right.
Yeah, also to that, the science literacy or numeracy effects don't replicate very well, it seems. And I mean, in your experiment, you didn't see it.
No,
right?
actually, I've also measured numeracy. I didn't show that.
Because the table Torun was using is precisely taken from one of Kahan's numeracy experiments, and it's designed that way. The numbers are supposed to look misleading, because the hypothesis, Kahan's hypothesis was, or I guess there is research on that people use certain heuristics when they look at tables like that, which rows they compare, which fields they compare to determine quickly what the evidence points to. And those tables are designed such that the heuristics will point in the wrong direction. And then, so this was part of figuring out whether there are such numeracy effects, because the more numerate people, the hypothesis was, would not be tricked so easily by the heuristics. And indeed, they are not in the neutral conditions. And then, at least in Kahan's experiments, there seems to be a numeracy effect, like you are saying, that the more numerate people actually do not see through it in the ideologically charged conditions. But it's very hard to understand what really is going on there. We actually have a paper on that, which is under review right now. So if you're interested.
I can also mention from our study that we see that people who are high in numeracy, when it's a neutral problem, they are, I mean, up in the top. They're almost 90-100% correct if they're really high in numeracy. The exact same, or it's not the same group, but it's people with similar levels of numeracy. When it's they get the polarized problem, they just drop down to, I mean, really, really low. So that's something that we are going to investigate further. What's happening? Why do they stop thinking? I mean, people who are good in numeracy. So it's not that they get more biased, but
that does suggest that a different cure is needed. So then it won't help just to teach them more math and make them better at math. The problem lies elsewhere in that case.
If it is motivated reasoning that's driving it, that's the problem that Katrin was pointing to. It could be that these people just know the answer. and therefore think the tables are not to be trusted. So that's an additional problem, right, with these. So, but if it is motivated reasoning, then numeracy, that won't solve that. That's just how it's set up, because that will counteract all of that.
Hilda?
Thank you for a very interesting panel. I was wondering about time and how opinion will change over time, because your experiments, they are just now, isn't it? And as a historian, I've been thinking about how did opinions about witch hunt shift, or smallpox vaccine shift, or women voters shift, and so on. And you see that, like in the witch hunt, the judges could offer another type of explanation. It could be I have to take it in Norwegian, bedrageri, eller kvakksalveri, altså andre ting, fraud, and the smallpox, you have to do it because if not, you couldn't be married. You had to have this vaccine, and women voters, it didn't end up in a revolution, it went on quite well. So is time, could time also be part of your experiments?
It's hard to do in a research program, but we have a historian involved, and he is really interested in cases through history where there was initially tremendous resistance to something, whatever it was, if it was the relation of the Earth to the sun, and then indeed vaccine cases from the 19th century and so on, where there was tremendous resistance and then it was overcome over time. And he's interested in looking at, and I don't remember the details of it now, he has a hypothesis of the sort of 4 or 5 central things that tend to push things in the right direction. And he finds a pattern in these cases. So this is something he's just starting now, Arne Jarrik, and he's one of the affiliated in our program, and quite interested in that. It is, of course, true that all these things, I mean, that is the thing about factual beliefs. They tend to correct themselves over time, because when it comes to value, the value disagreements, that's harder to sort out, but when it comes to factual disagreements in science or wherever, it tends to sort itself out, simply because accumulation of evidence becomes overwhelming. So it took the Catholic Church quite a long time to accept the position of Earth in the solar system, but most people, it was quick. So there is that it does sort itself out over time. But Arne's idea is that there are some central success strategies when you want to shift people's beliefs. Then, of course, the witch hunts is in its own case, it's very, very interesting, because there are lots of similarities to the spread of fake news and so on. There was new technology, printing press, right? Like we have new information technology now. There are lots of similarities to what's going on with the spread of disinformation now and the spread of rumors around witch hunts that some historians should look at. It's very interesting, I think.
Very good. Christian?
I'm not a philosopher, but I had also difficulties with that explanatory power. For the 30 seconds I had to read through it, I think the first statement that you said I had explanatory power was relying on much more, assumption. You would need to know how is the atmosphere, what is the evidence for this and that. The other statement was, I think, most important part, it's simpler, right? But maybe I'm just naive. But I'm sure that if you took I'm a natural scientist, but if you took somebody without a higher education, he would probably be very skeptical to the first statement. Now, my question was about the last experiment, the Skinner, was a very interesting experiment. So, but there are also some interesting details there. So I wonder about what your N number is and the statistics on it. Because it looks like you could get more out of it, but there were no spread or anything.
I didn't show that, no. We have about, in this final study that I show, we have 1,020 participants or something like that. So we have a good power in the study. I couldn't show you more details because I didn't have time. But if you're interested, you can just mail me and I can show you more about the data. And the explanatory power, well, I think you can do that better. It's not, if I may excuse myself, because it wasn't my study, it was Johnson. And I sort of bought his argumentation, but of course you could do it in a better way. I'm sure of that also, that you can make this argument, better than in this study, more clearer with explanatory value and differentiate it on that criteria in a better way. But that's what he did, and it showed some interesting results.
Yeah, and I know the political scientists, I don't know the details about this, but they're trying to grade argument quality and see what difference of argument quality does to how people accept the evidence. But I think we philosophers need to get a little involved there and look at how they grade argument quality, because it's not a straightforward task.
No.
I just have a follow-up myself in terms of the explanatory power. I noticed one of the studies you referred to used data from MTurk and had a number of
that was Johnson. There was Johnston's. Yeah. And he had Turkers.
Methodologically, the number was 170.
Yeah, it wasn't very much in that experiment. No.
That's a valid comment. Although these experiments are really hard to design, and talking about what you can do within some years. But it would be nice to. I also love experiments, and sometimes you are stuck with those kinds of. MTurk is very much used and is highly discussed. Yeah. Okay. We have more comments. Nils, please.
Yes. Okay. I'm mostly doing history of science, and I have some problems with the concept of knowledge, of course. I mean, the way you sketched it with these three criteria, I think the real problem is truth. Because there are so many different theories of truth. Correspondence truth, truth by agreement, more pragmatic ideas about truth. So, and in history of science, you really run into this problem. Because if you insist more naively on truth as a criterion, you get very quickly shut down. Because truth, what is that? So I think they don't accept an argument that something is true. It's very difficult to get historians of science, most historians of science, to accept that. Mm-hmm. They will always oppose you conclusions drawing on that kind of argument. So I'm wondering if this philosophical ambiguity about truth is not really a kind of pervasive problem here, which you have not addressed.
I don't think so.
Okay.
We don't. So I think one needs to distinguish all sorts of things here. We think of truth as a property of statements and beliefs. Some beliefs have them and some don't. Then you can have philosophical theories about this property. There are different theories. There is, as you say, versions of correspondence theory and coherence theories and so on. I don't think we need to determine which theory of truth is the right theory here, because I think the extension of the true beliefs and the true statements will come out the same way, either way. What we will...
Can't be true.
Well,
Can't be true.
Well, in our case, the cases we are looking... yeah. Look, I know I talk to a lot of people who do history of science, and they always say exactly what you say. And I think what they mean, really, is that it can be really hard to get certainty. And that's absolutely right. We think we have the truth, and we have the greatest evidence, and we think we're certain, and it's all there, and it turns out it was false. That's just the predicament we are in. And that's precisely because truth is an objective property. It's not up to us whether something is true or not. That depends on the world. So we are in that predicament that we need to collect the evidence as well as we can, and we need to be open for the possibility that we are mistaken. And it turns out sometimes we are. But what happens then is not that we had knowledge that we now no longer have. What happens then is that we discover that it wasn't knowledge. It was well-justified belief, but it turned out not to be true, so it wasn't knowledge. That's just the sort of bottom line that we work with. That we can handle that. That's the situation we're in. And that's why, of course, we have to, when you talk about knowledge resistance, you shouldn't pick factual beliefs where there's a lot of expert disagreement. That's not a good idea. Because then if there's a lot of expert disagreement, it's very likely that we don't know it, that we don't have sufficient evidence for this to qualify as knowledge. So you need to pick your cases right. That's very important.
Yeah, I think you're right, that for many cases this will work all right, as it did, in a way, for the psychological examples. You can discuss that and get to a conclusion. But I think it may be problematic that you can use this concept of knowledge more generally for politically sensitive questions. I mean, I've been studying genetics in biology, for instance. It's really difficult to apply it.
Well, I mean, there are truths there too. I mean, it's just that you should be you should do your science well. There was a lot of really bad science around, all sorts of things around the turn of the last century, for example, for political reasons. So, of course, but that's bad science. I don't know if you want to add something to this.
But bad science is not really a precise idea.
Well, politically driven science that's not evidence sensitive is bad science. For example, there are other kinds of bad science too. But politically motivated science is not good science, typically.
Any other comments or questions? No? Then I may have time to add a little thing on my own, because I loved your attempts to try to get closer to the mechanisms that can help us out of this, right? And I was thinking, I heard a story in the US from, I think it was a sociologist, which is my discipline. He had tested out, and I can't refer the details, but he tested out this idea of how you frame things matters to how people evaluate it. And he tested out two ways to have Democrats and Republicans relate to the main question: we need to preserve, we need to take care of the climate to take care of Earth, right? One way to frame this was to say for ideological reasons, like it was more value-appealing statements, right? The Democrats involved in this study said, yes, important. The Republicans in this study said, couldn't care less. Then the other framing was, we need to take care of the climate in order to take care of the Earth, in order for our children and our grandchildren to have, better living conditions. So it was more focused on family and kind of realism, not this idealistic value statement. And the Republicans were high up.
Wow. Interesting, really cool.
So I can't tell you whether this was an Antwerp study or what it was, but I think it's very interesting. And it goes precisely to your topic, how you frame things, and whether that resonates.
And
so that's a positive line or kind of conclusion, I guess.
Yeah.
Because we need to sum up now. So please,
okay.
Yes.
No, I mean, it's difficult to know generally how you should frame it for everyone to accept it. So it's more as I see it right now, at least, I see it more usable, perhaps on a smaller scale. If you have we discussed this before also, if you have a person in your a relative who is really skeptic, or a colleague at work who is really skeptic, then if you know this person's worldview, then you can sort of frame something in a way that is acceptable for this person. Then doing it on a larger scale takes something else, I think, something more.
Yeah.
I cannot really say what it is, but
we were talking before, because Torun, we were talking about cures, and Torun was a little, but how much of an effect can you really get on a societal level with these things? And we were talking about, well, maybe you can get it like over family dinner, or you can use these things. But to solve these problems that we are facing now, that democracy is facing, there's nothing to scale up here, obviously. That's obvious anyhow. But I think, and I said to Torun then, I think it's kind of like climate change, that there's a danger in focusing too much on the individual behavior. In this case, when it comes to crisis of truth, there's a lot of focus on källkritik, criticism of the sources, and critical thinking, which is putting the responsibility on the individual. Whereas what's really going on, you have to, and that's why the media people and politics people should be involved too, are two other things that are really central. One, of course, is a highly unreliable information landscape, that we are so susceptible to disinformation, because it's really hard to do this källkritik, to determine whether a source is reliable. It requires knowledge and time and effort. We are incredibly manipulable, and our levels of trust can be manipulated. And since trust is so essential, so there's that. So we need to fix that polluted information landscape. We need to do something. I think we need legislation. So one needs to lift the gaze. We need this. The psychological cures are interesting, and we should explore those, but we shouldn't stay there. The same point goes to critical thinking. Critical thinking is, of course, a very important capacity here. But how good you are at critical thinking depends on what you know, what knowledge you have, what beliefs you have. So if you have lots of false beliefs about climate change, you're not going to be able to do critical thinking very well. So you need to fix the information landscape as well. Then politics come into the picture, and there's a lot of research in political science showing that whether these kinds of lies, like the big lie, Trump's big lie, whether a lie about the reliability of the election system gets wings, so whether it gets around, depends on what the elite actors do, that what the politicians say, and what the big leading opinion people say. So one should also put a lot of responsibility there. So therefore I think we need the individual cures, and they are very interesting. We should do research on it, but it's important we don't only look there. We should look at the information landscape and at the political situation we're in now. That, of course, could be part of the cures, in a sense of cures too, and that is what the media people and the political science people are looking at. So you need to have the whole picture. And I should add, our next volume and our next sort of that we hope to put out together will be on cures, on the micro and the macro level, because that is, of course, the question to think about.
Very good. Katrin, you have a final comment?
No, I was just considering whether I should tell an anecdote, because we once talked to the Swedish Minister for Higher Education about our project, and she was very interested. But one of the questions she asked us, remember, was, so what are you going to do about it? we were a little perplexed for a second. And we said, well, we're going to tell you how it works, and then you need to take action.
You're the politicians, you need to do something.
Exactly.
We will give you the knowledge, the scientific foundation for doing something.
That's a very good point. Thank you all three for very interesting lectures.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.